Well, good evening, everyone. I'm Dr. Brad Gomez, the chair of the Department of Political Science at Florida State University and the co-director of research for the Institute of Politics at Florida State University, the IOP at FSU. I want to welcome you to our talk this evening by Dr. Lonna Atkeson, the University of New Mexico. Before we begin, I would like to say a few words about the Institute of Politics. The IOP at FSU is a world-class, nonpartisan, and nationally renowned institute aimed at promoting civic engagement in politics and public service. We are grateful for the support of the Florida State Legislature and other political leaders for recognizing the importance of citizen involvement, public service, and political discourse, and for creating the Institute of Politics at FSU. One of the primary goals of IOP at FSU is to provide students, faculty, and community members with opportunities for civic engagement that is also civil engagement. Through our academic fellowships, scholarships, and public programming, we hope to raise the level of political discourse in American society. It is in that spirit that we are happy to welcome Dr. Lonna Atkeson to speak tonight on why we need intellectual humility in the 21st century. We will have a question and answer period after Dr. Atkeson's talk. You can leave your question in the Q&A box, and we will attempt to answer your questions. Or you can raise your hand using the raise your hand icon at the bottom of your screen to ask your question directly during the Q&A period. Lonna Atkeson is Professor of Political Science and Director of both the Institute for Social Research and the Center for the Study of Voting at the University of New Mexico. A PhD graduate of the University of Colorado Boulder, Dr. Atkeson has had a distinguished and award-winning academic career. She is the author of 4 books on elections and American political attitudes, and she has authored over 30 scholarly articles in leading political science journals, as well as numerous book chapters and scholarly monographs. Lonna Atkeson is one of political science's leading voices on elections, and we are honored to have her with us tonight. Dr. Atkeson.
Oh, thank you so much. I'm really happy to be here. What a great introduction to a talk on intellectual humility, talking about the need for civil discourse. Perfect way to set up my talk. I'm going to share my screen and then let's see, set up my talk so I can begin. I'm really sorry about the, as I get everything going here. And play from start. Okay. I'm very excited to be here. Oh, let me do one more thing and get rid of the thumbnails so I can, okay, so I can see my own slides. All right. So I'm really happy to be here, even though I'm in New Mexico. I'm very excited to talk about why we need intellectual humility, what's going on in our country. We all know something's going on. We all can feel it. We know it's not right. Where is it coming from? And how can we as individuals work towards improving our civic discourse and reducing the polarization in politics? And that's what I want to talk about today. Okay. I have to use these, sorry. Let me just start by thinking about college campuses, because college campuses are a really important place where, we think that there is an open opportunity for political discussion and open discussion of any kind. But over the last couple of decades, what we've seen is a real increase in the number of college speakers who are being disinvited or who are having huge attempts to disinvite them. And this seems to me to be the antithesis of what the university is meant to be, a place of open discussion and open inquiry. But we've seen this, quite frequently over the last 2 decades. And it's important to note that these disinvites come from liberals and conservatives, and they come from Democrats and Republicans. If we look at the last 20 years, we can say that the Democrats and the left has been more likely than the right, but it sort of varies by time sequences. So about 3/5 of all disinvites have come from the left, about 30% from the right. And if we look at it over time, though, we can see that it varies quite a bit. Going back to 2000, you can see that, the right was more likely to disinvite people than the left. That also was also true in 2002 and 2004 and 2005. But since about 2005, roughly, you can see that the left has sort of been a leader in attempting to disinvite or successfully disinviting people from college campuses. And when we look at the list of people who have been disinvited, it's sort of quite shocking. I mean, they're important political players, or have important perspectives, and certainly represent different segments of our population. And so from the left, these are sort of some people I've picked out who've been, recently disinvited. This is the top person is Lisa Daftari. She's an investigative journalist. She specializes in Middle East politics. She's been disinvited because of her, focus on the region of which she's from. And she's been, classified as Islamophobic. To her left is a judge, is a professor, professor of law at George Mason University. And she teaches family law and religion. And she's a very strong Catholic and has done a lot of activity within the Catholic Church. And her views have not been popular on college campuses. And there's been lots of attempts to disinvite her. Mike Pence, former vice president, he's been, disinvited for his views on family and abortion. Below him, someone from the President Obama administration, Jay Johnson. He was secretary of the DHS, and he was general counsel for the DOD. And he's been disinvited for his views on immigration attitudes. Circling around here, Lori Lightfoot. Of course, we've all seen her during the pandemic quite a few times talking, and she's been actually disinvited for her attitudes on race and policing. And the two people to your left, Joshua Wing and Nathan Law, these are activists in Hong Kong, freedom activists, and they have actually been attacked by leftists, especially Chinese leftists in college campuses who don't support their freedom activities. So they've been a long number of attempts to disinvite them from campus. On the right, no surprise that Jane Fonda's at the top of the list as someone who's been disinvited many, many times for her long-held political beliefs and activities on the left. Of course, she was a big activist during Vietnam. Miko Peled is an Israeli-American activist who has, left views on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and he's a favorite for the right to try to disinvite. And Senator Bob Kerrey for his views on contraceptive and abortion. So there's a lot of activity around this in college campuses, and I think it's very disturbing, and it represents, I think, what's going on in our larger culture about disrespect for the other side and who they are and their opinions, and thinking about things in terms of enemies and allies instead of opposition, political opposition, but we're all under the same big tent. So there are really two views on political speech, and one of them is you should protect free speech. And the other one I would say is really you should protect free speech except for the groups that I don't like. And those groups are engaging in hate speech. And so there's a bunch of research on this, and it's pretty clear that leftists don't support free speech for rightist groups, and rightists don't support free speech for leftist groups. And we can see this. This was a recent experiment just a few years back. This was probably done at the end of President Obama's administration. And they were trying to look at, whether right or left-wing people were more likely to, believe or want to prevent the other side from speaking. And it came out that it was equal. Both left and right in his experiments did this. And he presented them with all of these, different groups of people with these questions, and then looked at what side they were on and looked at how they responded to these. And so I'm just going to read a few of them because when you read them, they really hit you, because some of them you go, ooh, I don't like that group. or, oh my God, I can't believe someone would do that. And so, hopefully one of them, as you sort of go through these and glances you, hits you, and it makes you think a little bit more about sort of your own perspective, and how different groups bring up different emotions inside you that lead you to feel that particular way. So, just starting at the top, I believe that members of Lambda Legal or Focus on the Family, the blue ones are leftist targets. And the red, well, I guess the opposite, the blue ones are red targets and the red ones are blue targets, but they're consistent with their partisanship. So I believe that members of Lambda Legal or Focus on the Family should not be allowed to organize in order to pass laws legalizing or banning gay marriage. I think that members of a state pro-choice or right to life organization should be allowed to distribute pro-choice, pro-life pamphlets and buttons on local college campuses. I think that an atheist or an evangelical Christian, which one group, should not be allowed to organize in order to remove the phrase "under God" from the Pledge of Allegiance in American public schools, or allow school prayer in American public schools. Just sort of jumping down a little bit, a couple. I believe that a person who supports or opposes Obama's healthcare reform should think that a protester should not be allowed to disrupt a congressman's town hall meeting. Sorry for the little typos there. That one you can really, I don't know if you remember, but that was actually going on during the election, that, people would, get up and start yelling during congressmen's town hall meetings. And so it became a real sort of public issue at the time. Whether, should be allowed to give a speech entitled George W. Bush or Barack Obama, our generation's Hitler. That's one that really, I was like, ooh, that one got me. I don't feel good about that. I could see how it just really, ooh, got me. I think that the Democratic or Republican Party should not be allowed to visit college campuses in order to register potential voters. So, when this research was done, they found that, left and right people were equally likely to not want the other side to be able to speak at their campus. So this really is an equal left-right issue. This isn't one-sided. Both sides are working to prevent the other side from getting their ideas out, or at least want to try to doubt that. Now, why is that? What's going on here? What's going on with political polarization the last, 2 decades? Again, we all know something's wrong. So all good theories start with an understanding of human nature. So that's where my theory is going to start, to try to explain this and try to understand, what we can do to make effective change. And so our theory is about how people make decisions, and what are people like? How do people process information? How do they do that? How do they think about things in order to form opinions and understandings about the political world? Well, people are motivated reasoners. And I think it's really important to understand that all reasoning is motivated. Sometimes it's motivated in a directional way so that you get the outcome that you want, right? And sometimes you're motivated to get the correct answer. You want the accurate answer. You want the answer that is actually right? Independent, because of the facts, how you look at that. Now, all reasoning is motivated. So we're always engaged in one of these, and more often than not, when we're involved in directional reasoning. And this is especially true in politics. When we think about ourselves, right, we can't always engage in motivated reasoning in terms of biased reasoning, right? Because sometimes we have to be correct, especially when we're talking about our own life. So let's think of something recently like voting, right? We all voted just a few months ago. There's a pandemic going on. And, if you're an older person, your risk of catching COVID and, having something terrible happen is much higher than if you're, 18 to 25, 18 to 30, maybe even 18 to 40. So this really affects, right, people's decision making. So what we see when we look at the data is we see that, older voters were way more likely to choose vote by mail options than younger voters, right? And so that's a personal thing, right? It's really important to be accurate. So we saw just a huge increase actually across the country in every age group, but then we can see a monotonic increase in vote by mail, as people get older, right? So that increases substantially. So, when it's your own personal life, you have to make the right decision, But when it comes to politics, that need really isn't there, because, politics is sort of a distant thing. It's, something I watch, or maybe I don't even watch, and it's sort of fun, something I can engage with in my friends. And so I don't need to be right there. I know what the right answer is going to be, and that's going to be much better for me, in my personal life with my friends and my family, to have the biased response, the response that's fits in best with my own worldview. So when it comes to politics, directional motivation is the default strategy, and we are mostly engaged in biased reasoning. Politics isn't central. So what's the problem if we make a mistake? It really doesn't matter that much, and it would be way more costly cognitively in my social life to take on, right, and try to be an accuracy-based reasoner when it comes to politics. Right? It'd be too high costs. So people aren't going to do that. So some people think of this as a problem with information, right? If we just gave people more information, right, that they could come to the correct conclusions. But it's really not about that, because it's really about this theory about motivation. It's not information. It's about motivation. What am I motivated to do? Am I motivated to be biased, or am I motivated to be accurate? And a really interesting experiment a couple of years ago, not my experiment, other people's experiment, and they were comparing sort of rash cream to gun control. And so they had people in all of these different conditions. And so in the rash cream condition, they gave people information, and they gave some people information that said that the rash cream was, good, and it helped resolve the rash. And then other people, they just switched the information around, and it would have showed you that the rash cream isn't good. And they did the same with gun control. They used the same exact numbers that they used in the rash cream experiment. And, the numbers either showed that the gun control law helped or it didn't help, right, in terms of gun crimes. And so in the rash experiment, right, what happened is, people with greater information, people who were able to understand and interpret the information, because they just gave it to them and people had to work through and figure it out. They found that people who were more cognitively able to handle the information were much better and good at figuring out whether they should use the rash cream or not. Right. And Democrats and Republicans were equally likely to figure this out. And that's probably why, we don't see any partisan difference on skin conditions. Right. Versus the gun control condition. Right. So that's really important, because nothing mattered. Politics didn't matter there, and information did. But using that same data in the gun control experiment, it didn't work at all. In fact, it was the opposite. People who were best at understanding the numbers and working through the numbers to figure out what the numbers said about right were much more likely to reject those numbers in favor of their political opinions. And in fact, what's really interesting, because this says something even more important, which is people who are the most knowledgeable about politics, the people who are the experts, are the most motivated to engage in biased reasoning. And that's a real problem, right? It doesn't have to be that way, but the problem is politics is different than rash cream, right? Politics is different than my personal needs. It's not the same. And so it's not about information. It's about motivation. In fact, the problem is that facts have very different level, and that politics really isn't about facts and lies. The fact that Florida is a state of the US is not something that is disputable. It's elementary matter of truth, and we all still agree on that. So there's many things that we still agree on as fact and truth. But political facts are much more difficult. They're never so clear, right? It's not just Florida is a state in the US, right? That's really simple, right? Political are complex because there are many components to them and many different considerations I can use to get to a particular outcome. So President Biden was elected, and one of his first actions was to stop the Keystone XL pipeline. and he blocked that. And so what's the political question? Well, is that right or wrong? Well, that's much harder. That's not like Florida is a state in the US, right? That's a difficult question to answer. It would take a lot of my time. Will that help the environment? Will that cause job losses? Is that important symbolically, right? In terms of thinking about a future with less fossil fuels? Will that increase or decrease pollution, right? What does that do to our relationship with Canada? Will that make us more reliant on foreign oil and less secure from outsiders, right? From threats. So those are really complex questions. And depending on how I look at that question, I could get a different answer. And so it's not the same, right? These are not the same. The problem isn't the information. The problem is that we're motivated. And in politics, we're motivated towards directional or biased outcomes. So when we think about where we are as a nation, we're very, very divided informationally. And this is really important to what's happening with our polarization. There has been so much change in how we receive information over the last 50 years that it has really altered our perception of the world around us. If we think back to what the world was like, 50 years ago, 70 years ago, we had a centralization of media. And that meant that we were all watching the same thing. There were only 3 stations. We were watching NBC, ABC, and CBS. They had the national news was on every night at the same time. And that's pretty much all you could watch. There really wasn't a lot of other things to watch at the time. And what we can see in research about what that did is it increased the knowledge of people who are really not very interested in politics because they didn't have anything else to watch while they were preparing dinner. And so, that's just what was on. And so that sort of raised their information. It probably lowered people who were really, really interested because they didn't have the kind of access to information that they do in a world where we have the internet. Right. So the mean, if we look at over time, what happens to political knowledge is in a centralized media environment and in a decentralized media environment like we have today, the mean is the same, but the variance is much different. Right. And the knowledge is much different. So political knowledge has a really long tail. And those people who were pulled up 50 years ago who weren't very interested in politics, now they're like zero because there's so much other stuff for them to watch and pay attention to that they're interested in. Right. So we've had this decentralization and fragmentation of media that allows people to observe, right, in their own environment, the things that they like most and the things that are most powerful to them and the things that they want to see and that they already believe. And in this way, the new environment, especially with the onset of social media, right, is that algorithms and AIs, right, have really taken over what we're seeing. And we are like voodoo dolls. If you go on Twitter, if you're on TikTok, there's an algorithm there and it wants you to be attentive to it because, you're sort of like the product and you're the product that is selling them and making them lots of money, right? By showing you the ads that they show you during this process. And so, Twitter, TikTok, Facebook, they have thousands of people like me, maybe 10,000s, maybe hundreds of thousands people who are just like me. They've seen me many times on their platform and they know exactly how to stick that pin into me to keep me coming back and to keep me paying attention and to isolating me into this world, this very narrow world. And that is creating huge problems in how we perceive the world. We're all on a freeway and we can't see anybody. Like if you're on I-10 in Florida around Tallahassee, imagine if you're all on a road, there's lots of people on the road, but you can't see anyone else there. And that's what's happening in our social media world. We're all on the same road, but we can't see each other. We're not hearing about each other. We're not learning about each other. And we're being nudged and pinned as a voodoo doll. And they have lots of people just like us. So they know exactly what to do to keep us interested. here's a really stunning statistic just recently from a poll. Are we rational people, or are we just rationalizers? Are we just motivated to be biased? So, thinking about how different groups, if you're watching Fox News or you're watching MSNBC or CNN or NPR, really different answers to this question. So 90% of people on Fox News said the US has controlled the outbreak as much as it could. But if you were watching CNN, nearly everybody said, no, that's not the case. Excuse me, the US has not controlled the outbreak as much as it could. I mean, that's just an amazing polarized statistic right there. I mean, it's just very stunning to me. And it really gets to the heart of sort of motivated reasoning and how our information environments are very different and how that's affecting our worldview. I did a study back in 2006 on Hurricane Katrina, and we actually looked at the media, and we looked at Fox News, and we compared it to CNN and the network news. And we actually surprisingly found that there wasn't that much difference in their news coverage of Katrina. They all were blaming President Bush. There was a lot of overlap. But if you look today, I have a colleague who's been looking now for a couple of years, and she gets on and she just every morning takes a picture of what's on CNN and what's on Fox News. And, it's a completely different agenda. I mean, sometimes what they're talking about and what is the most important story, they aren't even on their list. So it's really amazing. We are really in unique information environments that are really splitting us apart. It's really problematic. And this has led to our political polarization. In 1994, when fragmentation of media was just beginning, it was in the 90s that CNN comes around. We start having 24/7 news broadcasts. You can see that, we have a nice little bell curve here around ideology and where we are. And so that's forcing people to the middle, forcing candidates to the middle. But, here we are in 2017, and now in 2021, and we're just being pulled apart, right? I mean, that's a bunch of stuff is happening under that hood. Part of it is our information environment. And you can see that this is no longer a nice normal curve, and we're getting two heights at the end of the tail, right? Many more conservative people and many more consistently liberal people. And this is not how it always was. And information is one of the reasons for that. We are also a deeply divided nation geographically. We have been sorting for a very long time, and people who are more conservative are interested in living in more conservative areas, and people who are more liberal are living in more liberal areas. And on this map, when you have something like really dark red, the dark reds, those are Republican landslide counties, right? And those landslide here means where a candidate won by 20 points or more. So this is the presidential contest for 2020. And there's just, this has been increasing over time. So this year, 58% of voters lived in a county where, President Trump or now President Biden won by 20% or more. In 1976, that was only 20%, right? In 1996, that was 42%. In 2016, that was 62%, right? I mean, this is just, we're really so informationally we're divided. And then when we go into our neighborhoods, we're much more divided than we used to be. This is very problematic. So just nationally, if we think of all the counties in the country, 77% of all counties this year, or I guess last year now, were won in a landslide. That's just amazing. And not that there aren't that many swing states. There were 7 swing states in 2020, and there were 8 in 2016. So even if we move from a county level to a state level, we can see that there isn't that much diversity in many ways, right? There aren't that many places where there are, swing states that are very, very evenly divided. Yet, oops, wrong slide. So not yet. So one more point before I get to yet, is that if we think about what these districts look like, and this is just looking at ethnicity, they're really representing very, very different districts. So if we look at the average GOP House member, right, that's they get, what their district looks like. It's about 77% white, right? And 23% non-white. And if we look at, I hope I said Republican there. Anyway, and Democratic House members, right? It's 54% white. Very, very different environments. And then if we add on top of that, GOP districts are much more rural and Democratic districts are much more urban, the things are compounding in terms of the different needs and expectations from the government, from these different districts, right? So very different flavor across parties in terms of who they're supposed to be responsive to. And we are a deeply divided nation personally, like how we see the other side has really been changing. So in terms of human nature, it's really interesting because we really think of ourselves very highly. We have high individual opinions of ourselves, but we often don't have high opinions of others. So if we look at studies, we can find that, people believe that they are better than average in terms of, for example, estimating their own driving ability or catching their kids in a lie. But this is especially true for assessing individual personal morality. Experiments have shown that compared to other domains, people's morality, areas, things like honesty and trustworthiness, they really think that they're superior on. And so the magnitude between sort of what the average person is and themselves is much greater. And so in terms of human nature, we see ourselves and people who are like us, right, as paragons of virtue. Well, really, we don't see that abundance in others. And so while we see ourselves as virtuous, we see others as virtueless. And we can see this in this data here, where people are asked, how do you view the other party? So, the percentage of Republicans who say that Democrats are more closed-minded is 64%, right? The percentage of Democrats that say Republicans are more closed-minded is 75%. And we can see this all the way down, in terms of intelligence, whether they're immoral, whether they're lazy, goes back and forth with who's on top. But, these are important. How we see the other side isn't very good. And it comes back to this human nature, we're virtuous, but the other people are virtueless, right? And that's a problem for how we're looking at people, and the information and the sorting isn't allowing us to see people as people. There was just an op-ed in the Los Angeles Times that got a lot of play about a week ago, where someone was saying, gee, my Republican neighbor is so nice and, came over when my pipes broke and helped me with all this stuff. But, I can't really like him, right? Because, he's a Nazi, right? And, it was just incredible to me to see this, op-ed where this person is like, well, gee, why can't you see your neighbor as a neighbor? Why can't you, gee, really, they're a lot more like me. They have pipes that break too, right? So this is a huge problem. And it's becoming very deeply embedded in us that we're not supposed to like the other side. And between the sorting and the information, we have a really big problem because we actually believe we are right and that we should get more of what we want. And there's really not a big difference here, but just the way this is set up with this short thing sort of doesn't show that clearly. I need to expand my my y-axis, but there's only about a 5% difference here between Democrats and Republicans. My party should get more of what it wants on the key issues facing the nation. 62% of Democrats and 58% of Republicans say that. So, people really want their side to win and don't want the other side to win. I don't think people necessarily are wanting a great deal of compromise. They really want to win. And we are a divided nation politically, and this comes back to sort of where we started. It's a very close race, even though, states are sort of swinging, are not swinging. They're really predominantly either Democrat or predominantly Republican. There's not very many swing states, but the country itself is extremely split, right? Even in this most recent election, President Biden only got 51% of the vote, just over a majority of the vote. President Trump got about 47% of the vote. So that's a very close race in American politics. So even though we're very sorted and we have all these informational differences, we're very divided politically. And this really shows at the national level, and it's been like this for years. And when we think about this most recent election and what happened, it was just an unexpectedly close race. The results were clearly a split decision by the American people. The Democrats captured the White House and they gained the Senate, but and just barely, right, a 50-50 split. But Republicans made big gains in the House and in the states. And so, normally when we think of a change election, we think of coattails. When we think that there's a mandate out there, we think that the person who wins should have a lot of support, and we should see that support in the House, in the Senate, in the state legislatures. But that's not what we saw here. We saw a very mixed and not a change election, definitely not a change election represented in what was going on sort of down ballot and downstate, if we think about it, right? So even though the White House was flipped and the US Senate becomes tied 50-50, the House, went 12 up for Republicans, right? 12 increase of 12. There was no coattails for Biden. Biden has had some of the worst hotels and coattails in the last, I'd say, 80 years or so, 70 years or so. I mean, there's definitely some people we could look at who's had some problems, but this was not a change election. 2 state legislatures flipped from D to R, and 1 governor flipped from D to R. So given this condition, it was an unexpectedly close race. And what we see sort of, down ballot and downstate suggests that, we are a deeply, deeply divided nation. And, there isn't a clear will to go one direction or the other. When you have a 50-50 Senate and practically a 50-50 House, trying to build consensus should be a priority. One of the problems in our social fabric and our political fabric, our cultural fabric, is that, party is not very strong. Parties in America are very weak, right? Republican elites failed to prevent an outsider from gaining their party's nomination. Anyone can run on the party banner in America. And we certainly saw insurgent candidates on the Democratic side with Bernie Sanders. And that was, that sort of tears the party apart underneath. And we have very weak parties because they're really open. I can't believe this, but I found this, that there was a Satanist who ran on the GOP ticket for sheriff in New Hampshire just this last election, which just shows how parties are so accessible to everyone, right? And all kinds of people can access it. How did that person win? Well, they won because, you just mark your tribe, right? Mark the tribe and there we go, move on, right? So parties are weak, but partisanship or tribalism is strong. And we can see this. This is what we see literally every election, every presidential election. About 94% of the people vote who are Democrat vote for the Democrat, and 94% of the people who vote for the Republican are Republican, right? I mean, so partisanship is very, very strong when parties are weak, and that's a problem, right? Because anybody can get in there, and it's the party dimension. It's my tribe. It's not just my tribe. It's also how much I dislike the other tribe, right? We found that negative partisanship, or what we're calling now effective partisanship, is really an important fact in understanding, what leads to tribalism. And so parties are weak, but partisanship is strong. And this has been going on for a while now. Not back in the 90s, but some people go, oh, it's Trump. Trump was really the problem. But no, Trump was just, sort of a symptom of that problem in some ways. The two nations really, we don't like each other very much. And this is a cartoon from 2013. And I like to show this because I found it, and it's like, yeah, it reminds me that this isn't new. Maybe it's getting worse, right? But it's not new, right? There's nothing new about what's happening here. So the implication of the fact that, we're so divided and across all these different domains is understanding that sort of politics is about persuasion, and persuasion isn't about facts. Facts are important. I'll give you that. I think facts are really important part of the discussion, and we want to try and discipline our discussions and talk about facts within them and introduce data around our points. But it's really important that we understand that democracy and politics have never been about facts and lies. It's never been about experts, right? In fact, democracy is almost the opposite of expertise, because it's about individual voters making choices based upon their experiences, right? It's not about what the experts think. Democracy is about the individual and all individuals making their own choices. And it's important for us to understand that. Then it's also important to realize that external sources of information matter because there exist source effects, right? So if I'm a Democrat and President Biden says, the XL pipeline is, we just want to get rid of that. Well, my source effect is, well, that's accurate. I don't need to think about whether, that's really going to help, environmentalism or who's losing their job. I just have to take the cue and know who I should support. So, we don't share the same facts, but even when we do, facts are not the same as truth, right? Again, it's not about facts. Facts and truth are different. And we don't hear others' viewpoints because of sorting, because of social media. These are huge problems. We don't hear it. And the AIs are out there feeding us exactly what we want. Those algorithms, very frightening. Just pinging us with that pen all the time if we're on social media. And if we're like knowledgeable people, right, it even helps us more. I mean, we're seeing the same thing over and over, and that encourages us to believe that the world is mostly like that. And we have the capacity to reject easily information that we get that is inconsistent with our worldview, right? And even if we, even when we reject them, that can also extend to our friendships. We can defriend people, and sometimes we report them. My son, for example, one of his favorite teachers last summer, we read in the paper that she was put on administrative leave because of stuff she was posting on Facebook. And she was in some sort of political argument, heated argument with someone, and somebody on her feed from Pennsylvania reported her to the Santa Fe Public School District, and she was put on administrative leave while they investigated her. When school started in the fall, she was my son's counselor, but she ended up leaving about a quarter of the way through the semester. That I can tell you the effect on my son of realizing that his, one of his favorite teachers was leaving because of her personal, opinions, because she had a political fight with someone on Facebook, was extremely troubling. So we don't trust each other, and we are righteous about our own opinion. We feel morally superior. This is not a recipe for success, right? This is a recipe for something's wrong with our democracy. And we are on a tail. I don't know what tail we're on, but if you think of a normal distribution, I don't know if we're over here or over here, but we're on a tail of a distribution. And I don't know if democracy is safe. I'm concerned that we can potentially be in a cycle between left and right tyranny, right? Because the legislature is so weak. It can't seem to get anything done. It seems very performative, right? Again, because of social media, it's important to say the right thing, to represent you're in the right camp, right? You don't want to be canceled. You don't want to have any problems there. So my concern, right, is that democracy, right, is just going to be this pendulum right now going from, right to left and right to left as we move back and forth under basically sort of executive orders. And we can see, most recently, President Biden, he has had more, record-breaking executive orders than any president since Roosevelt. And I think it's even more now, right? I mean, this was like a week ago, I put this slide together, and now it's even more going out there. So, does that represent some, tyranny from the left and right? Do we want that back and forth? Is that dangerous to democracy, and what can we do about it? And so, what I think we can do about it is as at least as individuals, is we need to have intellectual humility. And humility is defined as freedom from pride and arrogance. And, it's about being sincere and honest and unselfish. Intellectual humility has to do with understanding the limits of one knowledge, recognizing that, I'm in a bubble and I need to, hear other people, and I need to hear them and take that in, that I'm willing to be open to new ideas, to be receptive to new ideas, to hear them or evidence at all, that I'm just, the rash cream experiment, right, needs to go into the gun control experiment, right? We need to have that outcome where I can look at facts and take them in, right? I can have that conversation, and I can think about how facts and look through someone else's eyes. Because remember, it's not the facts, it's how do those facts are perceived through individuals' experience, through someone else's truth in the world. Now, that doesn't mean ultimately you have to agree with someone. There's no expectation that you agree with someone, right? I mean, just like in a personal relationship, you're going to have conflicts, and, you're not always going to agree, but is the obligation of approaching the problem with intellectual humility to try and hear and listen to the other side and attempt to understand where they are coming from, and that that's an earnest place, that that's not a place of hate or shame, or that that's a place of earnestness that comes from real experiences. The benefits of intellectual humility are really important because intellectually humble adults are more likely to learn from people they disagree with. They're more engaged and attentive to the other side, and so disagreements can be more constructive and people can get places. They have more intellectual empathy, right? Or empathy with emotions removed, right? I hear what you're saying, but I'm not going to get angry about it, right? I'm going to keep my emotions down. My intellectual empathy is that I'm listening and paying attention and trying to understand other people's worldview from their personal experiences, right? And so that leads to more civil engagement, more meaningful engagement, and more productive engagement for everyone. And people who are intellectually humble are lifetime learners. So we have to be willing to expose ourselves to opposing party perspectives. They're not the enemy. They're just opposing perspectives. So we have to be willing to do that. And, that can be really hard. Listening to friends and family, listening to podcasts, whatever you're working on that have different views from you can be very beneficial to our intellectual progress, but it's really, really hard. So sometimes you just, you have to work to try to get there so you can do that. And I think we have to institutionalize individual diversity by encouraging discussion and exchange of ideas, because this really matters. So if we consider some, just examples of where these things make a difference, that opinion diversity matters, like the Space Shuttle Columbia, when it crashed. Why did it crash? Well, there was this huge report about why it crashed, and that was because there was a culture of discouraging dissent. And so no one felt safe saying that something is wrong. And that led to people dying, right? And we don't want that. That's not good. So we want a culture that encourages dissent, that allows for dissent. Another, private investment clubs are another example where sort of the mix of people makes a difference. So private investment clubs that are not friends and family oriented make a lot more money than ones that are friends and family, that are a group of friends and family, right? And that's because in a group of friends and family, it's harder to engage in dissent, right? It's because they're your friends and you don't want to disagree with them. But when people are not friends, apparently, and they're trying to work towards money, they're better able at discussing disagreement and making better collective decisions. Another place where we see, where opinion diversity exists and it seems to really matter, is that when there are judges, groups of judges who are all Democrat or all Republican, right? They are less likely, they're more likely to have more extreme opinions come out of their court when judges who are liberal and conservative are working together. So, I mean, that says something positive about a Supreme Court that is, going back and forth in terms of appointments between Democrats and Republicans. So the problem is that, like-minded people talking only with one another, well, we just usually end up creating, more extreme views for ourselves, and that's not a good thing. But when our views are challenged, right, then we're more likely to moderate our opinions, because we can see how other people's views also are sincere and come from a place of experience. So we need to stop the moral outrage. We need to listen more, and we need to be attentive. So I want to end with sort of, what have I done? And, what have I done? So in 2016, after the 2016 election, I redid my political behavior course completely. And I have now integrated the concept of intellectual humility as a moral theme in that course. And the idea is I'm trying to teach people about intellectual humility as I show them, right, through data that they crunch themselves, show them that people really perceive the political world through these partisan lenses that shape and affect their understanding of it greatly. Right. So one thing I've done is I'm trying to actively teach intellectual humility as part of my my pedagogy. And another thing I have done is I really try to listen to conservatives and liberals, and I try to listen to all sides of an issue. And so I listen to a bunch of conservative podcasters, and I listen to liberal podcasters. I've tried to watch, I watch CNN and I watch Fox, and I can tell you that watching both stations and listening to both kinds of podcasts has really helped me. It's really helped me to understand what other people are thinking. And, I can look, and I understand now why Democrats and Republicans call each other hypocrites, right? Because when I watch their newscasts and I listen to them, I hear where they're coming from and why they see that. And that has really changed my outlook. And it has made me more intellectually humble. Now, sometimes I can't do it. Like there are certain people who I've just never been able, even though I've tried, I just can't get past them. But there are many people who I have been able to find that I can listen to and understand their worldview. And that's been very helpful to me. And so just, sort of an ending point here, humility is not thinking less of yourself, but thinking of yourself less. And, I guess that's a great rule to think about how to approach politics in order to create a more at an individual level, like what can you do to reduce the polarization? And that's to try to be intellectually humble with others. So I would like to open to questions and discussion now.
Well, thank you, Lonna. We're going to, I want to remind you that we've, in order to encourage dialogue here, we've got 3 ways for you to log your question. You can either place it in the chat, or the best function is to use the question and answer box. Or if you'd like to raise your hand, we'll try to call on some folks as well. And you can voice your opinion. We'll unmute you and you can voice your opinion. So Lonna, here's the first question. It's from Hans Hassel, the director of IOP. One of the problems appears to be a lack of understanding of the perspectives of the other sides because of sorting, media choices, etc. However, what I've seen from studies that increase exposure to opposing views suggests that exposure doesn't reduce polarization. How can I work to better understand those whose views are different than mine when I do interact with those individuals? Or am I exposed, or when I am exposed to those views, how do we do that on a larger scale as well?
Well, really, it's not about changing your opinion, right? It's about creating intellectual humility. So you can still think they're wrong, but the idea is you go away feeling that they're not the enemy, that they have a perspective, that is a legitimate one. And that there is much more there than meets the eye, right? So I think that there is, and certainly my own experience, my N of 1 tells me that I have become more intellectually humble, and I can see that my students actually, over the course of the semester, become much more intellectually humble and talk about that in class. So maybe it takes a more active effort. Maybe the experiments, it's a repeated game, right? It's not a one-time game. You got to keep being engaged. And, it's the openness. You really have to open yourself to being willing to hear that. Now, I can imagine if you don't sort of encourage people to understand the perceptions, right, that how people think, how human nature works, that you may end with, hey, I'm just as polarized. I still think those other people are the enemy. But so you need that sort of initial, education, I guess, about human nature and how our brains work.
Charles Barrio in the chat asks, how do independents evaluate Dems and Republicans? Do they break one way or the other?
I don't actually know how they evaluate, in terms of likability. I don't know. It's a great question. That's something I should look at. Yeah.
Well, I don't know is one of the great ways of expressing intellectual humility. So, so there you go. She's practicing what she preaches.
I mean, I think, but what it is going to be is it depends, right? Because I figure in the people who define themselves as independents are, a lot of them are leaning one way or the other. And so they probably cross cancel out in terms of who they like more and less. And sort of evens out. And the rest of the people aren't that attentive to politics and don't care that much. So
it's interesting because in political science, in the 70s, we had a lot of work on independence. In part because we had a growing number of independents, particularly from the South, who were transitioning from Democratic identity to a Republican identity. But there's a lot less work on political independence today than there was during that period of time. And so this is raising some interesting questions, which probably warrant a great deal more investigation. Dina Rollinger asks, certainly the contemporary media system is complex and profit-driven, and individuals are motivated to reinforce existing beliefs. However, politicians, running and elected, also feed political tribalism, since there are benefits to doing so. How can we move the needle when there are more reward for tribalism than for intellectual humility?
Yeah, that's a tough one. At the political level, I mean, certainly elites talk about compromise and, talk sort of a good game, but I think in terms of their actions, often it doesn't seem that way. And, really this pressure has to come, ultimately from voters. I mean, part of our problem is probably institutional as well. We have the way we set up our campaign finance encourages, probably more extreme candidates, especially after Citizens United. We have these the primary nomination campaign itself, the fact that, who participates that can also lead to more extreme candidates. So we have a bunch of pieces in our institutional design that help to promote more extremism than more centrism. So, there could be some fixes in terms of thinking about changes in institutional design, or, also, pressure. Maybe we see if more open primaries produce more centrist candidates. There's a little bit of work out there that suggests that might be the case, or that, moving to different kinds of system produces more moderate candidates. So thinking about how we might do that to reflect that could be important ways to move that forward.
So Kana Corey had a question, but it was related to that last one. What will it take for politicians to move to humility? So let's move on to the next question. Kana, if you have another variation of that question, please go ahead and put it in. Trevor asks, where do we draw the line with using intellectual humility to handle opinions that may be hateful or cause harm? Should we always let speech or opinions like this reign free, or do we have an obligation to suppress this kind of behavior despite being dedicated to intellectual humility?
Well, I mean, I think what we need to do is open the doors so that people get information from other sources. So I think the hate speech problem is, really tied to our social media and the social media platforms, and then the algorithms that produce that and keep that. I've been thinking about this as a potential addiction problem, really, because, AIs and social media and algorithms, they're all set up to do very specific things that are very unhealthy for us. They're an addiction, They create this, you get on Twitter and, 2 hours pass and you don't even notice it. Same thing can happen on Facebook and other social medias. And that's what those things are meant to do. But that process is really bad for us. That's an addiction, and we regulate addiction. So, one way to think about that is that, maybe we say, okay, social media is a great thing. Of course, we don't want to get rid of social media. We can't get rid of it. But can we say that, well, you can't use algorithms that are going to encourage extremism, right? Because that keeps people attentive. So maybe we need to think about it in a different way and think about how these things are affecting us, how they're affecting, we regulate addiction all the time, right? We don't let people drive drunk, we don't let drugs freely out there. We regulate things that addict people. And I think we need to think about the mental addiction of the environments that we're putting ourselves in. And, is that where we can regulate it to sort of prevent those kinds of things from being the dominant feed that we're seeing that is increasing, our dislike of the other side and our recognition of the other as the other. Like, we're enhancing that through these processes. And so I think instead of saying, okay, the problem is we've got to regulate speech and figure out what speech is good or bad, which is really hard because, that's a matter of opinion more than it is a matter of fact, right? And so we can do that by ensuring, right, ensuring that the addiction property maybe isn't there. We need to have a discussion, right, about how to regulate social media so it's not so it's psychologically healthier.
Our next question is from Kenneth Mackey. It says, often in my life, I find partisans can't separate between the party and its leaders and the everyday party identifier. And I feel this is a major source of some of the negative partisanship we observe today. What are your thoughts on citizens confounding beliefs and attitudes of elites from those of the general public?
So say that again. I'm not.
Yeah. So what are your thoughts on citizens confounding the beliefs and attitudes of the elites versus the general public, right? So our elites are certainly more polarized than the general partisan, and yet we seem to be confounding the two these days.
Well, I think there's a lot more polarization in the public as well. Especially on the negative partisanship side or the effective partisanship side. While I would say agree with you that perhaps elites are more polarized. Because they're elites and they have more information and more knowledge, and they're working in a polarized environment. People are very polarized. There's all kinds of recent evidence that says that people are willing to discriminate against people on the basis of their partisanship for employment. Recently, I saw a senator put forward a bill to make political partisanship a protected class because of this. So I don't think, you say, oh, it's just the elites, but it's not. It's happening in the workplace that people are choosing people because of their values and not because of their, work or their experience, or maybe they're not choosing them, but maybe they're not choosing somebody because of those. So I think there is a lot of polarization going on in the electorate, and we are seeing it in these capacities. And there's a reason why people keep reporting that they feel they can't say the things that they believe in. And, I think there was a Pew poll about a year ago that showed that, Republicans in particular felt very attacked for their beliefs and attitudes. And, that was having negative consequences on their individual life. So I think individuals are feeling, the greater political environment and its effect on them. Even if a lot of people aren't that political, it can be pretty easy to say the wrong thing in an interview or a work life, that's not really intentional or representative, that can have real consequences to your job and employment. Just thinking, in fact, about the story I told about my son's counselor.
Haley Vetter asks, how do we differentiate from mainstream news sources on each side versus more partisan and extreme examples of media? Do you have examples of good news sources, podcasts, etc.? How do we find a balance between the opinions of both sides and the bare facts of a political issue?
Yeah, maybe U.S. News is, the most moderate newspaper, but their articles are all very short. So, I don't know that that exists anymore. This sort of neutral. There are certainly some aggregators that try to be neutral, or there's some experiments that have gone on where people, are presenting sort of, two sides of the same story. And I mean, that's an interesting approach. Maybe we need more of that. But I mean, I think most media today is, either more left or more right. It's not necessarily all extreme. And I try to sort of stay in that middle level of a little more conservative and a little more liberal. But no, I think it's really, we are in an environment where media is very, very polarized, because that's where they make their money, and you can make your money off a very small segment of the population. So I don't think there is a one media source that's like, okay, that's the reliable one. It's more complicated for us to do that.
Amanda Driscoll asks, do we need more bowling leagues and birding clubs? Has there been any research that shows that finding common ground on non-political issues can foster understanding and humility on political issues as well? Or might these simply be positive alternatives to being on social media all the time?
Yeah, that wouldn't have, yeah, probably the latter. And I don't know, but that's a great research question. I really like that. I think that's a great future idea.
Great. Well, I think that's it as far as our questions. Thank you, Dr. Atkeson, for this wonderful talk. And thank all of you who joined us this evening. Please remember to visit the Institute's webpage. It's www.iopfsu.com for more information about our future events and our work. And if you aren't doing so already, don't forget to follow the IOP at FSU on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter, and subscribe to our YouTube channel. Wow, I feel younger just by saying that. Good night, everyone. Thank you for coming out.
Thank you.